All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Good morning. Thank you for coming, first of all. Thank you for being interested in this topic and for getting up and making it to the conference. I know sometimes it's just hard to get out and do a thing with a bunch of people, so I really appreciate people coming to this talk. I'll do a little introduction about me. I'm an engineer at Cypress. We make an open source test runner that can test anything that runs in a browser. I'm also a program developer at People Making Progress. That's a nonprofit based in the Atlanta, Georgia area. We do services for adults with developmental disabilities. I worked there full-time for about 7 years. A lot of my opinions about accessibility are rooted in experiences that I had at PMP. I also volunteer at refcode.org. That's an organization that teaches early career coding skills and other kind of programming-themed content for refugees and immigrants. That's in Atlanta, Georgia as well. You can volunteer online. So if that's interesting to you, you can check that out and sign up to be an online volunteer if you would like. It's really great. You get to see a lot of people discovering programming for the first time, just like we all did probably years ago. Here's what we're going to cover in the talk. We'll start with what is web accessibility, and that will use kind of my definition based on my experiences working with disabled people. We'll talk about code as communication. This kind of underpins the strategy that I'm going to try to teach about. Then we'll talk about patterns and why patterns matter. This will touch on maybe some of the things you might already know about accessibility. We'll talk about why it's useful to have those things. Then we'll move into like writing and testing a component. So we'll have some examples there, and we'll think about putting the user first when we write our tests. After that, we'll just summarize, and we'll talk about some of the other benefits of working in an accessible way. There's a bunch of things that we're not going to be able to cover that you might have heard about related to accessibility. This is like WCAG, compliance, automated checking of text contrast and things like that. And we're really not going to get into the weeds of setting up the example project or like how Vue works or that type of thing. We're going to specifically talk about how the accessibility side works. So here's how I think about web accessibility. I think of creating work that disabled people can fully and independently experience. And the reason I talk about independence is that back at People Making Progress, that was our focus all the time. We're thinking of incremental improvements to someone's independence at completing a task. And the way that that influenced me for the rest of my life and when I started building software was to think back on experiences where I had seen somebody's independence limited by the kind of software that we were using. So a good example is if you can picture somebody who learned to clock in at work using a punch card. It's very simple. It records the time. You put the card in. It's all mechanical, and that person is done. When I started coaching people as a job coach, that was the kind of clock-in system they used. Then everywhere moved to like fingerprint scanners, usernames and passwords, all sorts of stuff where maybe you have to find your name and get to that in among the other employees, and then pick your shift and correctly do like this software interaction, which was really difficult for some people that I worked with who might be doing that in order to wash dishes or bag groceries or do those kinds of jobs. So seeing them have to ask for help to complete something that used to be easy for them and have to train on it taught me a lot about how software can control the level of independence, and even how software is made can do that. So when I think about web accessibility and like semantic HTML and things like that, I'm thinking about this layer of communication between a front-end developer and a disabled user. and this happens through the accessibility tree, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. The web is accessible by default. You may have heard that expression. Why aren't we just automatically good at this? Why doesn't the web just always work for disabled users? And a lot of it has to do with how we choose to build things, what we know about the needs of users. I would not have known the impact that my choices in HTML would make on someone's independence if I hadn't worked directly with people who use assistive technology and experience friction related to the choices that I made. So when I learned development, it's probably like a lot of us. It was a patchwork education where what I learned was focused on what was blocking me. If I wanted to learn how to do something, I would Google a really specific question. How do I add items to an array? How do I make a website? How do I do this in HTML? And there's not a systematic answer that says, oh, here's how to do it, and maybe here's why you shouldn't add a click handler to a div. Even though we can answer that question, it's still really difficult to put together all the implications when you don't know. So I don't fault anybody who gets really far in your career in front end for not knowing about accessibility. I don't know how you would know unless you have someone in your life or someone in your family who needs accessibility. I just want to, at a high level, cover some of the accessible themes versus the inaccessible versions. So on the left-hand side, we have something like semantic HTML. Headings are headings, paragraphs are paragraphs, buttons and links are buttons and links. That provides information that assistive technology can use. On the other side, we have things like div soup, which makes it unclear what actions are possible, what the nature of the content is. In an accessible website, form fields are always correctly labeled. In an inaccessible website, your users might not know if they're entering first name, last name, address, because your website might not communicate the relationship between the label and the form field. In accessible websites, things like color contrast and focus states are clear. And in inaccessible websites, some users can't read the content. They can't find out what's going to happen when they click or press space or enter because they can't see which element has focus. In accessible websites, known patterns crop up over and over. These are used by assistive technology to explain what's going on. And in an inaccessible website, patterns don't exist. Things are achieved in a way that's visual, it uses generic elements, and it's only really functional for sighted mouse users. So why does all that stuff matter? How does the HTML choices feed into someone else's experience? The way I think about this is we don't control the person or anything about the person themselves. They are like their own little packet, and they have their own hardware and software. They have a certain kind of brain. They have a certain kind of body and eyes and physical capabilities, and we don't care about any of that. What you would wish for is an adapter layer so that when somebody has a disability, it's none of our business on the website side. We work correctly, and their tools can interface with our work, and so it becomes irrelevant whether they have a disability or not, whether they're using assistive technology. It just becomes expected that things will work. And we do basically have an API like this. It's called the accessibility tree, and you can use it to communicate at a person-to-person level with somebody who's using assistive technology. So as the front-end developer, you're going to be able to say, this is exactly what's on the page. Here's what you can do. Here's what the structure is. And you get a lot of it for free working with HTML. So we'll take a look just at some examples. In a second, we'll open the DevTools and poke around at it. But imagine if you build a screen reader, and its job is to interpret the page. At the top, we have the div soup with generic containers. The screen reader is not going to be able to add any information that's not already there. So it's just going to read the content out loud in order. Just what are the words, what's the order? And if we look towards the bottom, the accessibility tree contains roles and labels and like contextual information, like what's a list. And this creates the power to interact with the content in ways that you might not think of if you've never watched someone use a screen reader. So the way that that works is if your headings are correctly structured, somebody can listen to just the headings and get a quick sense of what's on the page. When a list is encountered, someone can understand, oh, how long is this list? How many items are in it? Do I care about this list? You can listen to just all of the links and understand where you can navigate to from a certain web page. The hardest part about that is if all of your links are labeled Learn More, it's not very helpful to listen to them announced on a page, for example. So we have to think about that communication. What is the name of our link going to tell somebody who's skimming the page about where they're going to go? So I have Google Slides open, and let's use it. Google has a reasonably accessible interface, in as much as I can tell about it. And we have DevTools in Chrome that can convert this DOM into the accessibility tree and tell us about it. So I'll pick something random. This is a div. A lot of these are divs. But Google's got some stuff going on. We can see ARIA role, button. We can see some state. The app is communicating something. And so even though this is extra work that I don't recommend you do, if you want a div to be a button, you have to fix it with this extra layer of ARIA stuff. And then in the accessibility tree, it's going to just be this button. It's the same as a plain HTML button element. So I'd recommend just using the one that doesn't take extra work. But here we have an accessibility tree that you can see contains communication. This button here that says Add Comment, this is content that's not visible. It might show up in a tooltip. There we go. But it's also, if you're using software that goes to parts of the page and tells you about it, this label will be part of what's communicated through that software. So it's not just a picture you can click on. All of this stuff is interactive. There's state here. There's roles like tab, navigation. This is so different to the generic. And you can easily access these dev tools. It's in here, but it's because I've turned it on. I'm not delighted about this, by the way. If I go all the way to the furthest, most bottom item in this list that you can possibly find, there is accessibility information in the browser. I think this could be more important. So we have to enable this thing, and then we get access to the whole tree. But this made it click for me. When I was learning about accessibility and I figured I could see this instead of my elements, I don't really know or care too much about how this tree is made, but I really care that it's right. So let's talk about a process that you might use. I do this when I'm working on the front end and I receive a design. I'm trying to think of what are the things that have to make it into the accessibility tree. And if I have those, what do I need to make to service those? So this goes into component design, how we break it down, and how we can think about maintaining that accessibility tree idea, focusing on that user communication before we ever think about what's the easiest code to write, what's the visual organization. It gives us a really clear reference point for how things should work and what they are. So I look at a page and I think, okay, what are the big parts of it, right? If I've been given an entire page, what are the sections, the headings, the broad layout? And I'm looking for patterns. I do this a lot for just layout patterns, right? What's a 3-up thing? What's 2 columns? What are they going to do on mobile? We're already thinking about how these pieces work, but I think we could spend more time thinking about what they actually mean and what they are. I still use divs and spans a lot. There's a lot of layout. There's a lot of things I want to be generic. You can go too far with the accessibility tree just being too verbose. And so this is at a high level, the kinds of things I'm thinking about. And we're going to get into like patterns and components and how we keep this kind of sense with us as we work. The way to summarize this is to say accessibility starts before you write any code, and it's how you figure out what code you need to write. So when you look at a design and you're figuring out how are we going to work this up, you have conversations with the designers about what is this stuff. And sometimes those conversations all by themselves are really, really useful. I have found pretty often nobody knows what the stuff is. It's just shapes. We make shapes, we put shapes in a certain way, and it doesn't have a pattern. And that tends to be a really interesting conversation. So there's kind of 3 areas that are worth talking about for semantic HTML and content. We're going to go to the bottom one, which is the hardest. The easiest stuff is like documents. I have a news article. It's got an author, it's got a title, it might have links and a footer and pictures. You can do this with semantic HTML with no JavaScript, no interactions. It's pretty straightforward. And a lot of accessibility education stops there. It's like, use buttons, don't use divs, and you'll be fine. So there's another layer where things get interactive. At that point, there's 2 kind of forks. The conventional patterns are also pretty easy. So if you see something that looks like an accordion or tabs or carousel or something, you're going to be able to find an off-the-shelf component library for your framework that has that. And you can probably save some time by recognizing the pattern, looking for the library. You have to validate it yourself. You have to understand, is that library good? But then you can use it, and you can make an accessible component that disabled people can use independently. But then there's thingies. This is the designs that are innovative, that challenge the familiar patterns, that try to break out of what we're used to. A lot of like animations, scroll storytelling stuff, a lot of newer possibilities in the last 10 years or so are in this category. And it's so tempting to just build because it's hard to figure out mapping it to a pattern. And we don't always know the value of doing that. So we're going to look at a thingy. This is our example component. I have a video of how it works, and we have some requirements. So the situation where I've found this type of thing happening is like an interactive. That used to be the word that we used at my agency. That thing is an interactive. Well, that's not a pattern, so what does that mean? So in some cases, it's a diagram that has lots of bullets that you can click, and they have content. In some cases, it's like a moving, scrolling process thing that shows you how a factory works. So these are flashy, glossy catalog things that can be eye-catching, but are super hard to build. And that's often where we give up on the accessibility. So this example, we want a diagram with some layers. We want nested content in each layer. The nested content can expand and be interactive. As you scroll, there's like a lifting off or zooming in effect. And then all of the content is going to come from somewhere else. So we're going to have to deal with like a content management system, a component that's extensible. What's the structure that the authors of the component will use in the website when they're editing? So you have to think about all these things, and you can have some pressure. And then the designer sends you a video. And we learn how this works. So this is the beginning. I'm hovering. I'm clicking. We're about to scroll. So like we're reading an article all about avocados. And we've decided to distract people constantly with a widget on the side. But that's OK. That's what we're doing. And we're scrolling, and more stuff appears. And we can click it. And in this one, there's a link. And then in this other one, oh, there's an image. There's just one, but there's an image. This is often stuff that you might get in a sort of flat format, where even that nested image content doesn't reveal itself right away. You have to ask questions to be like, what happens when I click on the dot? And so this is a pattern that falls in between for me. And we have to ask some questions to figure out what it is. So we're talking about what's the goal? If we have a product owner, a product manager, a designer, what is the purpose of this so I can communicate that purpose to a disabled user? What does it do in certain situations? Like if they have reduced motion turned on, how will the scroll work? What if there's no animation? How do we communicate that these things are sequential and that there's like a lifting effect? What are the patterns we do know that this is closest to? Like it's kind of like a slideshow, but it's got the scrolling, so maybe it's not. It's also got no keyboard controls to move you through it. So maybe there's actually a missing thing that would make all of this easier. And I like to think about if I have to tell someone over the phone what I'm seeing, how it works, like what are those things? How can that lead me to the accessible, like core identity of the component? And then if we can't answer those questions, what compromises can you make with the designer, with the requirements, to make this something that's functional? So we think about the implementation of this. I have like 3 different things I'm thinking about. First of all, plain HTML can be the underpinnings of this and can help you understand what's the content structure. We'll look at that. Then we have interactivity, which lets you click between the things in some way. And that's a core feature that's like enhanced by the motion, but you don't start with the motion because it won't always be there. So you have to do something else to identify the core piece of this. And then we want to make sure that everything the user can do is always clear. It's clear which thing is on right now, and it's clear what the structure of content is. And then we have this usability question. Can I do this with a keyboard, with a screen reader? If I have certain settings turned on, will it still work? And we're thinking about, well, how will this work for everybody? And how do we not have to work super hard to customize this for this use case? So this is where, even when confronted with a hard, complicated thingy, I want to know what can we combine to get the structure and the interactivity and the animations all to work together, and how can we use existing patterns for dynamic content to do that? So the way I thought about this was that the outer layer is closest to switching tabs, kind of. It's like a carousel, but it's got this extra content inside. So if I was describing it over the phone, it's like, oh, can you switch between this and this and this, and we can get in there. The dots are okay, right? We have tooltip patterns, we have disclosure patterns already. Once we have a safe place like a tab for them to live, the dots are okay. And everything that's inside the dots, when I say at the bottom here, interactive content in the dots, that's really referring to links and things like that. So you have to be able to click them, but it's just HTML. So semantic HTML will be okay there. I did make two versions of this, though. There's a plain HTML version that is the author mode in our content management system. So that's how somebody could deal with this diagram when they're not running JavaScript, right? They want to edit the content and see what they've put in for each section and save it. And we'll actually take a look at that. So this is the plain JS version. And if you can imagine an interface for editing content over on one side, you would see this stuff. And so we're meeting the needs of the client or whoever by giving them a way to review things. And inside here, we have some article elements that have lists, right? We have an accessibility tree. And as the ultimate fallback, we really could think about content like this as being alt text for an image, as an accessible, structured version of this type of content. So that's an option. We can already see there's a bug here. We're going to come back and fix this, though. Because when I'm looking at the accessibility tree, what on earth is this disk? What does that mean? We talked about communicating something. Link little circle is not communicating anything at all. But this was my solution towards we don't have a way to deal with the keyboard or see it without movement. This is some little controls that I would be suggesting as a compromise. So we haven't changed the design very much. We've just added this. And there's still the capability to scroll back and forth. The animation is like a progressive enhancement to this otherwise tab switcher. If we use the keyboard, we should be able to get to it and get keyboard behavior and tab inside and see things and yeah, can we get to various parts of it? So this is the kind of testing I would do, but first I have to know what it is that I want. So as we looked at that interactive version, I didn't do almost any custom code. I used two accessible components that I Googled for. One is called View 3 Accessible Tabs. It's a great name. It's exactly what I Googled. It was the first thing that came up. So great, you're almost done. You still have to make sure it satisfies you and it works. It doesn't just claim to be accessible. But that's a huge head start. And then I used a headless UI popover component for the dots. So I know how that works already. I know that it follows ARIA correctly. So we have a huge head start. And I think that that was much faster than the last time I did work like this, where first I thought, how am I going to get the stuff on the page? How am I going to do the animation? Let's just make sure we can get it to work, and then we'll deal with the kind of consequences of that. But probably, once it's working, everybody's really ready for me to move on and do the next ticket. And also, it's really hard to impose accessibility and structure later when it didn't exist already. Because now your event handlers are on the wrong kinds of elements. Your DOM nesting might be weird. Things might be flat that should be nested. You have to redo a lot of things you already did to make an accessible version. And that's when you're trying to understand what is it, what's the meaning of things, what's the structure. And then you can't really talk to your designer and say, so this thing that looks finished to you and everybody else, what is it? What did I build? What's the meaning that I'm supposed to communicate? It's just like too late to have those problems. And so on top of the little tab pattern that we did, that's most of it. And then the scrolling comes at the end, because the scrolling is designed to trigger things that are otherwise accessible and can be triggered by users in other ways. So the scrolling is using GreenSock, and that's a common scrolling library. And what it does is at certain moments, it switches the tabs. And so it does a little bit of other stuff in the DOM too. Like this is a second image that's not really the same slide that you're moving, because a limitation of tabs is you can only have one active at a time. So this gradual transition is a purely visual change, and it happens with elements that are actually able to be removed from the accessibility tree. So you don't encounter two images when you try to navigate this DOM. We're able to hide stuff that's only for sighted users anyway. All of this doesn't need to be in the accessibility tree. Only the core identity of the component belongs there. So we saw a bug in the accessibility tree, and that's not the only bug that's there. There's a few. We're going to write some tests. We're going to talk about writing the test and refactoring the component. And so everything we talked about, that communication, that accessibility tree, to me, when we're writing a test as we build our components, that's how to hold your application in the test. As much as possible, hold it at that layer that communicates to the user. That is what you don't want to break. And anything that your test depends on that is not connected to something that's important to the user is kind of like a waste. Okay, I made a selector in a test that targets the second div under the something with a class of something. Users don't care. That information is not in the accessibility tree. So we'll talk about exactly what that means now, but at a high level, your tests are going to care about all the stuff we just talked about. So we saw this bug here. It's pretty easy to see that this panel has a circle in it. And I'm going to go to Cypress and look at the component test for this component. And the reason for this is that within the structure of your app and your tests, component development is where this actually lives. And it's where I want to specify the accessible behavior. So we'll take a little look at this test. It's importing the component, and we're mounting the component into the browser. we're going to skip everything about how that works. All you have to know is you can do it. And you can do the equivalent of this in other testing systems. So the first test is checking our core version. We can do a lot more here, but we can see there's the HTML. We expect a certain kind of title. And we can go through and confirm all the other content is exactly what we expect. We might test something like, this image exists, but it has an empty alt text, which is actually intentional because the image is really just decorating the rest of the content that explains what this part of the avocado is. So we can test for things like that in our plain HTML. And we can pick something else that we expect to be there, like exocarp, is that one? What do we expect exocarp to be? Okay, it's an H4. These headings are structured in a certain way. Somewhere there's probably an H3 nested higher. Cool. So I'm just going to write an extra test. We'll copy the other one. We'll say H4, and it's going to say exocarp. Okay, so this is good. It says it's passing. The reason I want this located in the component test instead of end-to-end or any other place is I'm specifying my component's behavior. And if I have this test open and I take a notion that I'm going to change this to a div, oh, I'm really going to, yeah, there we go. So now this test is getting ready to fail. I have it open. Let's zoom back out a little bit. And so it's complaining because we don't find this anymore, because it's not matching the spec in our test file that says this is supposed to have a certain accessibility feature. So this warns us really close to when we're doing the work. And also, the person writing a component test is usually an engineer, a developer, someone doing component development who understands the purpose of the HTML. So I put this back to an H4. The test has let me make an informed decision. Was that regression okay? Did I actually want a div there? Should I change the spec? Did the ticket I'm working on include changing the spec? So we can move on, though, to the next part of the test, which is more interactive. And we can say, sure, okay, what about these tab controls? We added those. They're supposed to have a certain behavior. I've got some little warnings in here. Because here, this is passing. But even in the log, what is this get within L? We got an A, it's the first one, then we click it, and we find a CSS class. So I could break a lot of stuff. And in fact, the gap in the test here is responsible for the bug that we saw earlier. Because I'm using this. Let's just pause the test and see what it's doing. I'm using this to find, oh, I guess I have to unpause it to get my nice, there we go. Let's look at what it found. So it's finding this middle one here, the item 1 in the array, and it's clicking that. But because it's not trying to think like a user, it doesn't notice that there's not a label. So we could think about what label we want here. What section is this? This is the mesocarp section. So I really want my link to say mesocarp. I'm going to forget all about this equals thing. And we're going to say mesocarp. And we'll expect this to fail at first, especially because it's the wrong command. Let's change it to contains. Contains is my favorite Cypress command. CSS plus content, really short. We can say it should have that, and it's not working. So inside of our component, we can find this and think about, where's our JS, where's our tabs? This looks pretty suspicious. There's another one of these somewhere. Nope, there's not. This is it. So here's a really gross way to fix it. Let's see what the HTML looks like. Well, it's in a link. Did we do a typo?
I think you need it to be in the second one.
Oh yeah, good point. Yeah, we didn't do it. All right, let's get rid of the surrounding part here. Oh wait, we passed. Yeah. And because I made them all the same, we picked the wrong one. So that makes sense. So instead, we're going to use like layer dot name, perhaps. And it has a whole different label in here. So the content is actually more specific than the single thing we're highlighting within the diagram. So this is the label that I would want to test. So I can grab this, put this into my component test. Cool. And so now we have a log that makes sense, find a link that contains the expected label, but obviously the visual appearance, it's better to me because I can see the text. But we agreed with the designer we'd put the little disk. So what I'm going to do is put the disk back and hide this text from like the visual part of the component. So the disk is back, and this is going to be our hidden. So we don't need the disk in the accessibility tree. And then we'll make a span with one of my favorite classes. A lot of code bases have this. You might have it if you don't even know already. SR only, meaning screen reader only. So what we should have is our visual appearance looking one way. Let's come back to this browser. And we'll take a look. Cool, so the link says outer shell. And for some reason, I haven't figured out, I didn't like hide the disk correctly. But it's okay, we'll live with that for now. The principle is, at this point, somebody who can't see it could still understand what it does. They'd make it through. And like this gets us to a level of basic usability. If we do this over and over, we will have an accessibility tree that meets a basic standard. And until we're at that point, we probably can't even get feedback from a disabled user because they don't know the content is there. They don't even really know what they might be missing. I would much rather have a functional interface that you can get through, and then you tell me it's really annoying that my screen reader says small round disk before all the titles. Could you fix that, please? Often what happens is there's no keyboard behavior, there's no labels, so people can't tell you about the problem. They can't even use your website. So there's a lot more things in that category that we can talk about. But the underlying idea is the test is checking the behavior at the component level in a way that we care about. So if we go back to this test for a second, the way it was written before, and we can put all this back in, the way it was written before had two problems. The first problem is it didn't catch we were missing a label. The second problem is we've said that this content is dynamic. It can be changed by a content author. And so this equals 1, this doesn't really matter. The second item in an array of items is not meaningful. So if our test fails because the content has changed the order and now we don't have this like heading, we have a needlessly flaky, brittle test. And when you have those, people start to hate to test. So, oh no, I changed one thing in the DOM, and now all of my get, div, span, second child, whatever, all of those are broken. It's so hard to maintain your tests and care about them. So having a focus on accessibility through your testing actually makes your tests way more resilient to changes in the DOM, because you don't care about things that don't matter. And when your test fails, it's because something you specified that you care about isn't working. There is a part of this that I also want to test from end to end, though, because it's sort of like a page-level concern. And I think this can be tricky, especially when you're getting started with testing, because there's this scroll behavior. So this is an end-to-end test that works in much the same way. And the end-to-end test just goes to the home page, and now we have everything that's on the page. And I'm doing some stuff here to like trigger scrolling through GreenSock. And all of what I'm getting here is like, okay, cool. We're still able to test the outcome. We're in a different context. And if you've written component tests that specify this, I think there's a reasonable chance other teams writing end-to-end tests might take a peek at this code and realize they can copy this good practice into their end-to-end tests. But even if they don't, even if they know nothing about accessibility and they test in really complicated or brittle ways, or they test things that don't matter, you as a developer can know that you still have these passing tests that confirm your responsibility in communicating through the accessibility tree. So this means accessibility starts before you write tests. It's how we decide what tests to write. And to me, it's the only thing that aligns everything in front end. So how are we designing? How are we building? How are we testing? What is the guiding principle of organizing front end? To me, it's all about accessibility, because very little else architecturally, code-wise, has any effect on users. So I don't mind what the framework is. I don't mind anything, really, except the HTML, which is the output of our teams and our companies and our software. We've just got these giant machines that make HTML. It should be the right HTML. That's like the core of correctness in terms of testing and requirements and how I think about software. There are a couple of other benefits that come along with working in an accessible way. And I want to touch on them because these can be persuasive to teams who might be hesitant about what they perceive as extra work. And we can talk about how this alignment actually helps you work faster, more effectively. For me, I have better job satisfaction when I make stuff that the people I know can use. So it's really important to me. But it also makes better processes, because you have these decisions and conversations earlier with designs. you're able to talk about product questions in the context of what are we building. I think it has much better kind of returns on cutting down miscommunication and review cycles because you have to be clear about what you've made. It also improves code quality to me, especially when you're looking at front-end code. If you see divs and classes, and maybe even more so when the classes don't have semantic names anymore, so it's a div and then like 40 or 50 Tailwind classes, and that's your dialogue element or something, it's actually really hard to parse that in the HTML, in your code, in your components, compared to code that has semantic elements where you can tell when a meaningful container starts and ends, and you can tell that something that's generic, like a div, like a span, is intentionally generic, it's safe to change, it's probably the start and end of a layout thing. So just at a high level, parsing and using like even tools in VS Code to jump around a document, this nested structure, semantic HTML is better. You also have a better sense of what is someone going for, what should I expect in this code. I used to just do stuff, just start building and get stuff to work, and like most of the things I did would look different 6 months later when I was learning different techniques and different libraries, whereas in an accessible, focused code base, a lot of how the front end is made is going to be consistent over time because you're trying to find the patterns that are already in the wild that represent this content. I have a long list of resources here. The slides are in the chat. Homer Gaines is doing a talk later today about these 4 principles that he mentions here. Those are really useful. Everything in here I consider to be pretty friendly and approachable. Watching Leone's talk about actually surfing the web with a screen reader is incredible. If you have not seen that before, it might be surprising. So it's worth checking all these out. There's a few things that you can consider doing. People Making Progress accepts donations, and it's my favorite thing if somebody would put $5 in there sometime. You can volunteer at RefCode, like I mentioned, and Cypress has a few positions open. You can look at cypress.io/jobs for that. So that pretty much does it. I have a form here for feedback. If this was useful or not, I'd really like to know. It would also be useful for asking Cypress to continue to get me out to talk about accessibility. So if you have any feedback, good or bad, feel free to put it in this form. And if we have any questions, I think we have like 5 minutes or so where I can take a question. And for the record, with the light, I actually can't see if anybody's got a hand up.
So, how did you get into technology and accessibility? Did you do that work when you were working in that disabled helper job?
So I got into it like making things as a teenager, and then I had a big left turn of like, went to college for music and English and came back to tech later. Because as a teenager, I thought I was really bad at this, and I couldn't make like visual basic work with a book from my library in the small town in Ireland that I grew up in. And I didn't have a community like we have today to help me learn. So I went from, I know how to make HTML web pages, and then I had a whole separate career in nonprofits and disability support. But I did gradually realize, like, I could make things to help that company. So with the example of logging in, I made a duplicate of the login page for a place that my team would go and volunteer, where I could teach somebody how to type their username and password. And she was motivated because on our version at the office, if she got it right, there'd be like twirling ballerinas at the end. And we could like put a picture of the keyboard on the screen so she could see she's pressing the right things. And so that little bit of work was useful in that situation. But I would have much preferred that they just wrote names down when you got there, like they always used to. Like we might have been overdoing it with like this process in order to let someone volunteer to pack meals at like a food program for sick people and stuff like that. So I'll be in the chat, I'll be on Discord, or you can find me for the rest of the day as well. If you want to talk about this, thanks very much for your time.